January 1744. A carriage hurried through the Russian winter, carrying a 14-year-old German princess to St. Petersburg. Christened Sophie Friederike Augusta, in Russia, she would take a new name, Catherine. She was to marry the heir to the Russian throne, and must have imagined her future in this frozen land, and dreamt of a loving husband. But her hopes were in vain. Her marriage would be loveless. This young princess would instead fall in love with Russia. "18 years later, the year 1762. At the Russian court, the age of elaborate wigs and lavish balls was coming to an end. They held no interest for Empress Elizabeth's successor, the 34-year-old Peter Fyodorovich. Not even those close to the new emperor knew quite what to expect from him. He fidgeted constantly through ceremonies, liked to play with toy soldiers, and often said out loud that he'd rather rule a civilized country like Sweden than a wild one like Russia. Chapter 1. Peter III Fyodorovich. Peter was born Karl Peter Ulrich, son of the German Duke of Holstein, a nephew of King Karl XII of Sweden. His mother was Anna Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, making him heir to both the Russian and Swedish thrones. Peter, orphaned at the age of 11, was brought to Russia by his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. She had him convert to Russian Orthodoxy and renounce his claim to the Swedish throne. At the age of 17, he married the 16-year-old German Princess of Anhalt-Zerbst, who converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Catherine. Peter quickly discovered he had nothing in common with his young wife. Although she was beautiful, he found her dull. He played his violin for her and tried to include her in his own hobbies, but she was interested neither in his music nor his toy soldiers. Catherine was intelligent and well educated, but in Russia, she felt isolated. Catherine confided her innermost feelings to her diary. "I see very clearly that the Grand Duke doesn't love me at all," she wrote. "I will be very unhappy with this man." Peter's antics, meanwhile, exasperated those around him. His courtiers painted an unflattering portrait, suggesting he'd inherited Peter the Great's love of drinking, as well as his wild, unpredictable behavior, which baffled and infuriated his advisors. They reported that he talked such nonsense in front of foreign ambassadors that it made our hearts bleed with shame. Peter behaved erratically throughout his adult life. Some thought he had a form of mental impairment. Others thought his development had been affected by a serious bout of smallpox as a teenager. Nevertheless, Peter received a brilliant education and excelled in the natural sciences, mathematics, geography and fortification. He spoke German, French, and even some Latin, although his Russian remained poor. The prospect of becoming Emperor of Russia appealed to him not at all. In contrast, his wife Catherine was determined to be accepted in her new homeland. She practiced her Russian lessons late into the night and read books about Russian history and the lives of the saints. She even studied the old Slavonic language of the church. She got up early to help the servants stoke the palace fireplaces and practice her Russian with them. Soon, she spoke the language fluently though she never completely lost her German accent. When Peter III became emperor in 1762, he began a period of frantic legislation. In 186 days, he signed 192 decrees. He abolished the hated secret chancellery and the use of torture, and allowed 20,000 people to return from exile in Siberia. He ended the persecution of the so-called Old Believers and took land from the monasteries and gave it to the state. He ordered that babies should be baptized in warm water. He approved the formation of Russia's first state bank and the introduction of the first banknotes. He declared forests to be a national resource and granted new civil liberties to the nobility, exempting them from compulsory military service and allowing them to travel abroad for the first time. There were rumors that Peter intended further sweeping reforms of the church. He certainly showed little respect, laughing, joking, and talking loudly through services. In contrast, his wife Catherine remained standing through long services, observed all the fasts, confessed her sins, and received communion regularly. Her calm and pious demeanor made the emperor look like an oaf. Catherine never had any illusions about her husband, even in the early days of their marriage. She recalled one incident in her diary. "When I entered the chambers of His Imperial Highness," she wrote, "I was shocked to see that he had hanged a huge rat. I asked him what it meant. He explained that the rat had committed a criminal offense. It had climbed over the wall of his cardboard fortress and eaten 2 guards that were on duty. So he ordered the criminal to be tried according to military law. The rat was hanged at once and was to remain there for 3 days as an example to others." Catherine and Peter were completely unalike. They shared no interests and had nothing to say to each other. And there was another problem. Everyone at court knew that Peter and Catherine did not sleep together. After a few years, it was less an item of court gossip than a looming dynastic crisis. Russia and the Romanovs needed an heir. After 9 years of marriage, Catherine finally became pregnant. According to one account, Peter had surgery to correct a condition that had prevented him consummating the marriage. According to another account, Catherine was seduced by her chamberlain, Sergei Saltykov. In any event, in 1754, at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul Petrovich. As far as Empress Elizabeth was concerned, Catherine had fulfilled her only duty, to provide the Romanov line with an heir. She now intended to raise the precious child herself. Catherine's infant son was taken away from her. For several years, she lived virtually alone. It gave her plenty of time for her favorite pastime, reading. For a Russian Grand Duchess, Catherine had unusual taste. Her favorite writers were all French philosophers, men such as Diderot, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Her other great passion was for handsome men. Her first lover, Sergei Saltykov, was soon sent on a diplomatic mission to Sweden. But Catherine soon found a new favorite, Stanisław August Poniatowski, a young Polish noble attached to the British embassy. They had a daughter named Anna, and in time, Catherine would help Poniatowski to become the last Polish king in history. When Catherine turned 30, she took a new lover, a handsome, boisterous guards officer named Grigory Orlov. He and his 4 brothers, all officers in the Guards wielded enormous influence and effectively controlled the loyalty of their regiments. Catherine was cultivating powerful allies in St. Petersburg. By the time Peter became emperor, husband and wife were barely speaking to each other. Peter didn't even know that Catherine was pregnant again, this time with Grigory Orlov's child. The birth of an illegitimate child could be the excuse Peter was waiting for to get rid of his unloved wife. It had to be kept secret. On the date the baby was due, Catherine's chamberlain, knowing Peter loved watching huge fires, went to an extraordinary length to lure him away from the palace. He ran to the city and set fire to his own house. Peter set off to see the great blaze, while Catherine gave birth to a son in a far wing of the Winter Palace. In time, the emperor discovered the existence of both his wife's illegitimate children. He remarked casually, "God knows where my wife gets her pregnancies from. I don't know." Peter was not a faithful husband either. His mistress was Elizabeth Vorontsova, a lady-in-waiting, and he wanted to marry her. But first they would have to remove one major obstacle: Catherine. Peter planned to imprison his wife and their son Paul in the Schlisselburg fortress near St. Petersburg. Rooms had already been prepared for them. Catherine knew she had to make her move first. She also knew that the emperor had made himself many powerful enemies close to home. The King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, was Peter III's idol. It didn't matter to Peter that Russia and Prussia had been at war for several years. When Peter became emperor, he immediately made peace with Prussia, giving away Russian conquests. Then he made his own guard regiments adopt Prussian uniform and brought in strict new codes of discipline, also based on the Prussian system. The guard regiments, pampered for years, were outraged. The Guards were the elite troops of the Russian army. Based on the toy regiments created by Peter the Great for his war games, the Preobrazhensky, Semenovsky, and Izmailovsky regiments retained a close relationship with the sovereign. The Leibgards guarded the imperial palace and were a political force to be reckoned with. In a span of 37 years, the Guards were involved in no fewer than 6 palace revolutions. June 28, 1762. The Montplaisir Palace, 6 a.m. Catherine was woken by Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother. "It's time to get up," he told her. "Everything is ready for your proclamation." She dressed quickly and got into a carriage. A few miles outside St. Petersburg, they met Grigory Orlov and went on to the barracks of the Guard regiments, where they were welcomed with cheers. Catherine had been preparing the ground for this move for months. 10 a.m. Peter was still asleep at Oranienbaum, 20 miles outside the city. At noon, a huge crowd followed Catherine's carriage as it drew up outside the Winter Palace. It was met by a welcoming committee of senior state officials. At the Peterhof Palace, Peter was told that the Empress had vanished. He searched her chambers in person, looking inside her wardrobes and under her bed. When it was discovered that Catherine was in the city gathering support, he sent messengers to find out what was going on. None of them returned. Instead, they joined Catherine. Peter took a boat to the naval base at Kronstadt, hoping that the fleet remained loyal to him. A galley carrying all the ladies of court followed him. The emperor intended to use them as hostages, since their husbands had all sided with Catherine. But the fortress at Kronstadt opened fire on Peter's boat. The commandant announced that he recognized no emperor. Russia was ruled by Empress Catherine. In St. Petersburg, the people gathered on the shore with sticks and stones to prevent the emperor returning to the capital. 24 hours later, after learning that the Senate, army and fleet had all sworn allegiance to Catherine, Peter agreed to sign an act of abdication. The guards arrived to escort him to the royal hunting lodge at Ropsha, a few miles outside the city. Peter went out to the carriage, handed his sword to an officer, and fainted. Catherine had no legitimate claim to the throne. By precedent, she could claim no more than to be acting as regent on behalf of her infant son, Paul. Catherine, however, chose to present her palace revolution as a fulfillment of the people's will. Her ascension to the throne was, she declared, by the will of all our subjects. The immediate question was what to do with her husband, Peter. He'd written to her in French, addressing her as Her Majesty, and swearing not to conspire against her or her government. He'd added a postscript in bad Russian. I also beg you, honoring your will in everything, to be allowed to go to faraway lands. It was too risky to let Peter go abroad. Perhaps she should send him to the Schlisselburg fortress, where he could join another former emperor, deposed more than 20 years before by the Empress Elizabeth, Ivan VI. But two legitimate ex-emperors posed too great a threat to an illegitimate German-born empress. A week after the coup, Catherine received a letter from Alexei Orlov, who was keeping Peter under house arrest at Ropsha. It contained the news that Peter was dead. The circumstances of his death remain unclear. The official cause was hemorrhoidal colic, but he was almost certainly murdered. 2 years later, the second problem also resolved itself. During a rescue attempt at the Schlisselburg fortress, Ivan VI was killed by his guards. In September 1762, 2 months after the coup, Empress Catherine was crowned in Moscow. Chapter 2. Catherine II Alexeyevna. At Catherine's coronation, 1,200 poods of silver, more than 19 tons, were given out to the people. Crowds were then treated to a masquerade involving thousands of musicians, giants, dwarfs and jesters. They ate fried beef and drank from fountains of Rhenish wine. The festivities lasted 3 months. The main attraction was the Great Imperial Crown, containing 4,936 diamonds weighing 2,858 carats in total. On top, a red spinel weighing 398 carats and 72 Indian pearls. Its value, 2 million rubles, about $200 million today. Catherine was the first Russian empress to dedicate most of her time to work, not her own pleasure. Compared to her predecessors, she led an orderly life. She preferred plain food. Her favorite dish was boiled beef with salted cucumbers, and she hardly ever drank. Even during state banquets, she drank blackcurrant juice instead of wine. She also kept to a strict daily routine. Catherine rose at 6 a.m., read until 8:30, then worked on papers with her secretaries from 9 to 11. From 11 to 1, she met with courtiers, and from 1 to 2, she had lunch. Courtiers read aloud to her between 2 and 4. Then she received visitors until 6 p.m. Then she might play cards for a few hours before dining at 9 and going to bed no later than 10. The philosophical treatises that Catherine had read in her youth now began to bear fruit. The Empress decided to establish a new style of government in Russia, Enlightened absolutism. Its main principles were to be freedom of thought and speech, and equality for all classes before the law. Russia still used a legal code that dated back to 1649, known as the Sobornya Uluzhenia. Catherine ordered the summoning of a legislative commission to debate new laws for Russia. Its delegates were to be drawn from all the classes and regions of the empire, and were to come to Moscow bearing written instructions from their constituents. Before the commission met, the Empress wrote down her own ideas about the law in a document that became known as the nakaz, or instruction. It took 2 years to write and contained more than 600 clauses. It discussed the rule of law, the abolition of the death penalty, the presumption of innocence, the concept of liberty, the different classes, and serfdom. The nakaz provoked extreme responses in Russia and abroad. In France, the birthplace of the Enlightenment, it was banned as dangerously liberal. Now, as her legislative commission was convened, the eyes of Europe were on Catherine and her daring experiment in legal reform. The legislative commission that was to draft the new legal code was made up of all classes except the serfs and clergy. 564 deputies were selected, 30% were nobles, 39% were townsmen, 14% were peasants, 5% bureaucrats, and 12% were representatives of other estates, such as Cossacks and frontier tribesmen. They met in no fewer than 203 sessions. The commission met inside the Kremlin. Catherine secretly watched proceedings from a hidden gallery, used 100 years before by the Tsaritsa and royal princesses in an age when women weren't allowed to join men at banquets. The more the commission talked, the clearer it was there was little common ground between the different estates. Sometimes it seemed the soldiers were the only thing that stopped them from attacking each other. One issue bridged the gap between the estates. Merchants, Cossacks, and industrialists wanted the right to own serfs, like the nobles did. While Catherine was striving to nurture liberty, the delegates wanted the opposite, and weren't afraid to say so. The only thing on which the deputies were unanimous was their desire to present Catherine with the titles the Great, the Wise, and the Mother of the Nation. Catherine wasn't impressed. She wrote irritably, "I told them to work on the laws, and they do an anatomy of my qualities. Only God is wise. Great? History will judge." But she welcomed one title, Mother of the Nation. With the commission deadlocked, Catherine took matters into her own hands. She ruled by decree, prohibiting the export of grain, imposing price controls on salt, and creating new laws against corruption. But trouble was brewing for Russia abroad. The growing might of the Russian Empire was a source of growing unease for France. When Catherine put her former lover Stanisław Poniatowski on the Polish throne, she antagonized France yet further. She had also broken a promise to Turkey not to interfere in Polish affairs. In October 1768, under pressure from French agents, the Turkish Sultan declared war on Russia. Catherine sent her best troops and generals against the enemy. The Empress had a flair for recognizing talent and promoting those with ability. One beneficiary was Count Peter Rumyantsev, former favorite of Peter III. He'd expected to be dismissed after Peter's overthrow, but instead, Catherine gave him command of an army. Count Alexei Orlov was considered by many to be debauched and dishonest, yet Catherine gave him command of a naval squadron. Alexander Suvorov was an unassuming 30-year-old major when he first met the Empress. She gave him her portrait as a gift, a moment he later described as paving his way to glory. According to some estimates, he went on to win 93 battles for Russia and was one of the few generals in history never to be defeated. In July 1770, the two armies met at the river Laga in modern Moldova. Rumyantsev smashed an Ottoman army that outnumbered him more than 2 to 1, 38,000 Russians defeating 80,000 Turks. That same day at Chesma in the Aegean Sea, Alexei Orlov led his naval squadron into action. He too won a stunning victory against a much larger force, 32,000 Russians defeating 73,000 Turks. On August 1st, 1770, near the river Kagul, Count Rumyantsev attacked and defeated a Turkish army that outnumbered him 5 to 1. His 32,000 men routing 150,000 Turks. 4 years later, at the village of Kozluja in modern Bulgaria, Suvorov won the last great land battle of the war, once more attacking and defeating a larger Ottoman force, his 25,000 men putting to flight 40,000 Turks. The string of victories against the Ottoman Empire caught everyone's attention. Soon, ambitious young officers were traveling from across Europe to seek service with the Russian army. Among them was a Spaniard, José de Ribas, future founder of the city of Odessa. He was nearly joined by a young Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, who changed his mind because foreigners were hired with a demotion in rank. Meanwhile, at home, Catherine was waging another war with her lover, Grigory Orlov. Her favorite had a furious temper, while she could be jealous and resentful. They would often quarrel furiously, make up, and quarrel again. They had had a son together and lived like husband and wife. Grigory wanted their relationship to be recognized as such and made official through marriage. But Catherine was worried it would undermine her position as empress. She asked her closest advisor, Count Panin, for guidance. He told her, "The Russian empress can do anything she wants, but Mrs. Orlova can't be the Empress of Russia." Where Panin leant against the wall, his powdered wig left a mark. From that moment, it became a ritual for courtiers to press their foreheads against the mark, hoping for Panin's courage when they had to give bad news to the Empress. After 12 years, Catherine finally tired of Grigory Orlov. That year, 1774, plague struck Moscow. Every day, 1,000 people perished. Officials fled the city and riots broke out. Orlov volunteered to go into the plague-ridden city. With the guard regiments, he restored order, organized the burial of the dead, and opened hospitals with his own money. In 1 month, the epidemic subsided. Orlov returned to St. Petersburg in triumph. The Empress's love was briefly rekindled. But 2 years later, while Orlov was away negotiating with the Turks, she found a new favorite, a young officer named Alexander Vasilichkov. When Orlov found out, he was furious. He broke off negotiations and rushed home to see Catherine. But her courier met him en route and handed him strict instructions to go to his palace at Gachina and not to come to court. Grigory eventually calmed down, and a few months later was allowed to return to court. He and the Empress remained friends for the rest of their lives. Catherine and Peter's son, Paul, was now nearly grown up. Many expected Catherine to hand over power to him soon, or make him her co-ruler. It was a time when Catherine needed people around her whose loyalty was beyond question. So the Empress turned to a 35-year-old Major General, a devoted and trusted friend, Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin. Catherine and Potemkin soon became lovers. She later wrote of her need to him. "My heart cannot be content even for an hour without love. If you want me to be yours forever, show me friendship as well as affection, but love me and always speak truthfully." She called him my student, my friend, my idol. Soon, she couldn't bear to be apart from him, and when he left the capital, she wrote tender letters addressing him as my dear husband. Their affair began in the spring of 1774. It's widely suspected, though it has never been proven, that they were secretly married just a few months later in the Cathedral of St. Samson in St. Petersburg. It was also rumored Catherine later bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, who took the surname Temkina. But even this affair brought Catherine only fleeting happiness. Catherine and Potemkin were both headstrong and always tried to impose their will on the other. Eventually, Catherine had had enough. While Potemkin was away in the provinces, Catherine took a new lover, Peter Zawodowski. Potemkin wrote to Catherine threatening to kill the man who'd taken his place. But she had made her decision and told Potemkin, "The first sign of loyalty is obedience." Zawodowski was her favorite for just a year before he was replaced by Semyon Zorich, a cavalry officer 14 years Catherine's junior. The next lover was even younger, 25 years her junior. Catherine chose her own lovers, but for counsel and company, she always returned to Potemkin. Many years later, Catherine's last favorite, Platon Zubov, 38 years her junior, wrote, "The Empress always gave in to Potemkin's wishes and feared him just like a demanding husband. She often pointed to him as the example I should follow." It was the tireless Potemkin who oversaw the colonization of Russia's new lands in the south, known as Novorossiya, New Russia. For centuries, this territory had been ruled by the Muslim Tatars of the Crimean Khanate, but in 1774, as part of the peace treaty of Kuchuk-Kanaji, it became part of the Russian Empire. A few years later, taking advantage of Tatar weakness, Catherine annexed Crimea itself. In just 4 years, Potemkin brought 400,000 settlers to these new lands and founded the cities of Yekaterinoslav, Nikolaev, Mariupol, Kherson, and Sevastopol, the new home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Its warships built in the shipyards in Taganrog and Kherson. Potemkin invited Catherine to inspect her new lands in person. He organized every aspect of the trip, down to the tiniest detail. It was like nothing else in history. The imperial party consisted of 3,000 people, traveling in 14 carriages and 164 sleighs, including 40 spares. Catherine herself traveled in a specially constructed giant sleigh, housing an office, a parlor with room for 8, a card table and a library. It was pulled by 40 horses. The trip lasted 6 months and covered 6,034 kilometers. At every one of the 375 relay stations, 550 fresh horses were waiting, as well as fresh provisions, 6 cows and calves, 30 hens and geese, 500 eggs, 80 kilos of flour, sugar and butter, 6 hams, 8 kilos of coffee, a barrel of herrings, 50 lemons, and 3 buckets of wine. The Empress visited 35 cities, each of which welcomed her with great fanfare and celebration. At Balaclava she was greeted by an all-female regiment of Greek Amazons, while at Poltava 50,000 extras reenacted Russia's great victory over the Swedes. Catherine's great tour of the South became legendary and gave rise to myths of its own. Amongst them was the story that Potemkin tried to trick Catherine about the number of new settlements by lining their route with fake villages built from plywood, with actors playing the role of peasants. The story gave birth to the phrase Potemkin village, a fake construction or facade that creates the illusion of prosperity. But the towns and villages of New Russia were real. The myth was created by foreign observers, reluctant to believe that Russia could so quickly consolidate its hold on such a vast region. Welcomed and acclaimed across New Russia, Catherine was made to truly feel like the mother of the nation. The Austrian Emperor Joseph II and other foreigners traveling with her were full of admiration. This, of course, was Catherine's desire, to make a powerful international impression. The Ottoman Empire, however, was incensed by this triumphal procession and declared war in a bid to win back its lost lands. The result was a series of brilliant Russian victories on land and sea. The bright stars of Rumyantsev and Suvorov were joined by a new Russian naval hero, Fyodor Ushakov. In the course of 2 years, he fought 4 battles against the Ottoman fleet, all of them won or drawn, despite always facing superior numbers. His bold tactics rewrote Russian textbooks on naval warfare and would be studied by Russian naval officers for generations to come. When peace was made, the Russian frontier advanced to the river Dnistra, taking in the fortresses of Achakov and Kajibi, the future city of Odessa. Russia's status as a great European power was now assured. No European state now dared to act without first considering the reaction of Empress Catherine. The empire's internal situation, however, was cause for serious concern. The most influential woman of her age faced constant challenges to her rule. During the first 10 years of her reign, 7 pretenders to the throne emerged, all claiming to be Tsar Peter III, having miraculously escaped death. In the 11th year of her reign, an 8th pretender emerged and declared war on the Empress. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. Until recently, he'd been a common Cossack from the Don region, a veteran of the 7 Years' War. Returning home, he helped some friends desert, and as a consequence, became a fugitive himself. He rode to the Urals and told the Cossacks that he was the true Emperor Peter III, back from the dead. Then he stirred up a peasants' revolt. Pugachev's manifesto promised all things to all men. Land for the peasants, freedom for the Cossacks, justice for the Tatars, Kazakhs, Bashkirs and Kalmuks. He promised to protect the people from corrupt government officials. Live free like the beasts of the steppe, he told them. Pugachev's people lived free indeed, taking whatever they wanted by force, robbing from the poor as well as the rich. A month after Pugachev's manifesto, the Empress responded with one of her own. She informed her subjects that a fugitive Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev had gathered a band of thieves and vagabonds around him and dared to style himself emperor. She called on his followers to give up their ways or face severe penalties, including death. But it was too late. In just a month, Pugachev's 80 followers became 8,000. In 3 months, he had an army of 24,000 men, made up of peasants, Cossacks, Bashkirs and Kalmuks from the steppe. The rebellion had plunged the whole region into anarchy. Catherine would have to do more than write a manifesto to regain control. Of the Ural region's 89 factories, 23 were completely destroyed, and 33 more were looted. The violence cost the factory owners around 1 million rubles, worth about 5 billion rubles today, or 140 million US dollars. The losses to factory workers and peasants, whose houses were looted or burnt down, and whose cattle and property was stolen, amounted to about another 1 million rubles. Many people were killed or went missing amid the violence. The official death toll was 2,716. Catherine sent government troops to crush the rebels, but they stumbled into disaster after disaster. 3 provinces, Kazan, Nizhegorod and Voronezh, were soon in flames. Because of the war against the Turks to the south, Catherine had no more troops to send. But as soon as peace was made with the Turks, regular troops flooded the region, and the revolt was suppressed. The defeated Cossacks handed over their renegade leader to the government. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in a cage, like a wild steppe beast. His treatment and interrogation were authorized by the Empress herself. Pugachev, along with 6 other ringleaders, was sentenced to death. On January 10, 1775, in front of a huge crowd in Moscow's Balatnaya Square, one of the most dangerous and charismatic rebels in Russian history was executed by quartering. By law, Pugachev's legs should have been cut off first, then his arms, and only then his head. But by personal order of the Empress, Pugachev and his comrades were granted a small mercy. They were beheaded first. The Empress later declared Pugachev's rebellion to be a national tragedy and ordered its events to pass into eternal oblivion and deep silence. Catherine believed that the rebellion had been caused by the state of Russia's provincial government, archaic, incompetent, and corrupt. The entire administration of the empire needed overhauling. It was to this great task that Catherine turned next. "My quick quill will be the death of me," she wrote to the French philosopher Voltaire. "I've never written so much in my life." The result was 216 pages on reform of the provincial administration of the Russian Empire. Catherine's reforms began with a complete reorganization of the empire, doubling the number of provinces from 23 to 50. Each province was subdivided into between 10 and 20 districts, all of roughly equal size. These new provinces and districts would be the new basis for local government. 216 towns received city status. Each city, from the capital downwards, became a separate administrative unit, divided into its own districts and quarters. This system was in use with few changes until the Russian Revolution. Some of its measures even remain in use today. Then, shocking news arrived from France that would halt Catherine's reforms in their tracks. Louis XVI, King of France, had been guillotined. Catherine had never been a friend of the king, but the news made her physically ill. The French Revolution was the largest political and social upheaval of the age. France's monarchy was overthrown in 1792, and a republic based on freedom and equality was proclaimed. The ground had been laid by Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot. Now revolutionaries like Robespierre, Marat, and Danton sought to fashion a new state from their ideas. The Empress was thrown into panic. The French Revolution had been inspired by the same ideals that drove her. Was she paving the way for a Russian Robespierre or Marat? Would she be the next monarch to lose her head? She offered to send Suvorov and an army of 60,000 men to crush the revolution. It did not happen, but from henceforth Catherine looked on her old Enlightenment ideals with deep mistrust. Catherine kept the title Mother of the Nation close to her heart. There was hardly any area of Russian life she didn't look at to see how it might be improved, from provincial administration to the duties of Russian midwives. Her reign saw the birth of Russian journalism and satire. She even contributed to such magazines herself. In 1795, she joined forces with Frederick William of Prussia and Emperor Joseph of Austria to carve up Poland, annexing territory in Belarus, Western Ukraine, Lithuania, and Latvia. She wrote no fewer than 36 literary works, including 11 comedies and 7 operas. Her reign saw the construction of great buildings and monuments in Moscow and St. Petersburg, designed by men of genius such as Bazhanov and Kazakov. She initiated smallpox vaccination in Russia, vaccinating herself and her son Paul. She amassed an unrivaled collection of artwork that became the basis of the world-famous Hermitage Museum. She was a patron of Russian artists who themselves became masters: Fyodor Rokotov, Dmitry Levitsky, and Vladimir Baravakovsky. The scale and breadth of her achievements were awe-inspiring. No one could doubt her right to be called Catherine the Great. For Russia, Catherine's 34-year reign was a period of dramatic growth. The population of the empire soared from 19 to 36 million. The conquests of her reign surpassed even those of Peter the Great. 29 new provinces were created and 144 new towns founded. The army doubled in size from 162,000 to 312,000. The navy grew from 6 frigates and 21 ships of the line to 40 frigates and 67 ships of the line. Her generals and admirals won an incredible 78 military victories. Meanwhile, industrial output boomed. The output of cast iron tripled. Russia became the greatest producer of cast iron in the world, overtaking the former world leader, Great Britain. The value of Russia's external trade rose from more than 9 million rubles per year to nearly 46 million rubles per year. State revenue quadrupled, from 16 million to 69 million rubles. Catherine built on the foundations laid by Peter the Great 80 years before, to create a giant and powerful new Russian empire. Many later generations would look back to her reign as the zenith of Russian imperial glory. But forever mindful of the limitations of power, she compared her own work to a drop of water falling in the ocean. In 1796, in her 67th year, Catherine prepared to draft a decree on her succession. She intended to pass over her unloved son Paul, to make her 19-year-old favorite grandson, Alexander, her heir. She did not live to see it completed. On November 6, 1796, Catherine the Great died of a stroke. Her 42-year-old son, Paul, became emperor. In just 1 month, it was plain to see why the Empress had tried to remove him from the succession. Catherine the Great was never wrong.